everyone, and welcome to today's Atlanta Authors Hybrid Author Presentation. My name is Lou Conti, and I am your host for today's event.
We're a little like good.
I'm good. I'm with this. Today we welcome LYNN CULLEN to discuss her newest book, The Woman with the Cure. Welcome, LYNN. She's sitting right over here. It's a pleasure to have you here. Before we get started, some virtual housekeeping items for our Zoom audience members who are on mute. If you have any issues during the presentation or would like to submit a question for LYNN, please use the chat function. We will have a Q&A session at the end, and I will present your questions to LYNN at that time. Also, we suggest that you change your screen view from speaker view, from gallery view to speaker view, so that you see who is speaking on the screen rather than all the other Zoom attendees. Atlanta Authors has been holding author events at the Roswell Library and virtually for the past 12 years, and the list of authors is impressive. We are so excited to be back meeting in person, and we appreciate your attendance. These days, bookstores, libraries, authors, and publishers need our support more than ever. Thank you all for being here today to help Atlanta authors keep the literary world alive and well into our future and our children's and grandchildren's futures. I want to thank my fellow Atlanta Authors Committee members, Deanna Smith, Marilyn Barron, George Weinstein, who is with the Atlanta Writers Club, Judy Stanton, Annelle Gerson, the owner of our favorite local bookstore and the book miser herself, and our two newest members, Diane Stevenson and Kathy Chaffee. We also want to thank the Friends of the Roswell Library and the Friends of the East Roswell Library for their unwavering support. In addition, we work in association with Roswell Reads. That program has been alive and growing for more than 16 years. Signed copies of LYNN's books will be available for purchase in the back of the room or at Book Miser. Book Miser is located at 3822 Roswell Road in East Cobb, less than a 10-minute drive from most areas of Roswell. Those of you on Zoom can go to their website at bookmiser.net for more information. We will add their information to the chat area of your screen so you can find it there as well. And those of you who signed in, if you failed to put your email address on the sign-in sheet, we'd love to have you do that so that we can contact you with our next event. Okay, and now I'm inviting Annelle Gerson up to introduce today's author.
No, a little further up.
Okay, how about him?
Excellent.
Perfect. All right.
Well, thank you, Lou, and thank you, all of you, for being here today. I know that my definition of euphoria is being in conversation with an extraordinary author and incredible readers, but in truth, I realize there are lots of other places you could be today. So we thank you for the privilege of your time. I can assure you, long after today is over, you will remember LYNN CULLEN, you will remember The Woman with the Cure, and you will remember an incredible pioneering woman by the name of Dr. Dorothy Portsmouth. So, in addition to it being my pleasure, it is also my honor to introduce you to today's guest author, LYNN CULLEN. Lynn's love of history began at a very early age. Growing up in Fort Wayne, Indiana, she could be found roaming the riverbank near the location where legendary Johnny Appleseed planted his apple grove.
And now,
Yes, ma'am.
hold up 1 second. For some reason, they're saying there's echoing. And so I want to just make sure.
I can talk without a mic.
Try that, but they are saying they can't hear because of the echoing. So I want to make sure that all the sound is off.
I have a school teacher voice, so I can speak loud and clear without a mic. Exactly, right?
You can go and continue, but I'll just see if I can figure it out.
Okay. When not roaming those hills, she was reading biographies. And as for writing, Lynn will tell you a childhood adventure and writing assignment with her Aunt Ruth may have had a hand in planting the seed for her lifelong interest in writing historical fiction. While her daughters were young, Lynn worked for a time in a pediatric office and later on the editorial staff of a psychoanalytic journal at Emory University. Simultaneously raising children, working full-time, she wrote children's books, a total of 11 chapter books and 3 picture books. Moi and Marie Antoinette, The Backyard Ghost, and The Mightiest Heart are 3. And for the last title, she was named 1999 Georgia Author of the Year. When I think of Lynn's books and her backlist, I'm often reminded of Barbara Mandrell's song, Remember I Was Country, when country wasn't cool. Do we all remember that? Well, because Lynn has been writing about historically overlooked women way before the whole genre of historical fiction addressing overlooked women was cool. So it was in fact 2007 when she turned her eye toward historical fiction and released I Am Rembrandt's Daughter, which promptly became a 2007 Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writers selection. This was her first novel for a general audience, and it was the result of 8 years of history and travel. Her tenacity to get it right, to conduct extensive research, and whenever possible, travel the streets of her story are characteristic of all of Lynn's books, and for me are what make them so memorable and so powerful. So after that, 2010, The Creation of Eve. It was named among the best fiction books of 2010 by the AJC, and an April 2010 Indie Next selection. Reign of Madness, 2011, was chosen as a 2011 Best Book of the South selection by the AJC and was a 2012 Townsend Prize finalist. The Townsend Prize, for those of you who are not familiar with that, is a prize given to writers of Georgia. So the best writers of Georgia get nominated, and she has multiple times been a part of that incredible distinction. In 2013, she released Mrs. Poe. Now get ready. It was Book of the Week by People Magazine, a Target Book Club book, an NPR 2013 Great Read, an Indie Next List selection, a Book of the Month at Costco, an Oprah Book of the Week, an Atlanta Magazine named it one of the best books of 2013. Twain's End, continuing her trajectory, was released in 2015, named People Magazine Book of the Week, again a Townsend Prize finalist, an Indie Next selection, named a book all Georgians should read by Georgia Center of the Book. You get the idea. The Sisters of Summit Avenue was released in 2019, and the book we celebrate today, The Woman with the Cure, has just been released in 2023. She has been called the Bronte of our day by the Huffington Post.
Wow.
I'm not sure, exactly. I'm not sure I could cite an accolade that is more impressive than that. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming LYNN CULLEN.
That's right.
We did not plan that. But we're on the same wavelength, so it totally figures. Thank you, Annelle. I don't even feel like speaking now. I'm done, but anyhow, thank you for the lovely intro and for your lovely support. And I hope you all will continue to support Annelle. She is instrumental in bringing in authors and having us in events all over town. She's behind so many of them. And we thank you. We need you. Please support her too. And I want to thank the Atlanta authors and Atlanta Writers Club for their tremendous support over the years. All these books that Annelle talked about, you have been there for each one of them with me, and I so appreciate it. Couldn't do it without you. So thank you. And today, I want to thank you for coming. It's a beautiful day, and I appreciate you.
Yeah,
I appreciate
I'm
you.
getting complaints.
I appreciate you spending it with me. So let's get going on this. I'm here today to talk about The Woman with the Cure. This book began with the talk with my friend in my neighborhood really 20 years ago. My very good friend Karen Torgali and I would walk every Friday and talk about all kinds of things. But she was an oral historian for the CDC for a number of years. And it was during those years that she told me about the pioneers of epidemiology with the CDC. And, you know, these people who brought vaccines and changed medical history. But the pair that got my attention was Dr. Salk and Dr. Sabin in the race for the polio vaccine. And what was interesting to me, well, there's many facets, but they were so flawed, these two, and it's such a competition. So I think sometimes they lost track of, you know, why they were in this competition. They were just at each other's throat. So I knew almost from the start, from hearing about them with Karen, that I wanted to write about them. But I said, Karen, what about women? Weren't there any women in this race? And honestly, she was kind of stuck there. She had to do some looking, and she found some women that I couldn't. Really, there just wasn't much about a story that I could do with them. So I'm going to be referring to this one in particular. The reason that their race had such high stakes was because of polio. And when their vaccines did come out, it was front page news, literally, across the nation. When Salks came out, people soaked their store windows with, you know, thank you, Dr. Salk. When he made his announcement on April 12th of 1955, church bells rang, cars honked on the streets. It was just this national celebration. Same for when Sabin had his vaccine come out in 62 is when he made his announcement. And I'll be getting to that. The point is, people were thrilled. They came out in droves. Kind of like how people came out for the first COVID vaccine. You'll be seeing a lot of parallels between the two pandemics as I go here. But the polio pandemic had its own terrors for people. And the reason why, you know, Salk was such a hero, because he delivered people from these terrors. Everybody thought of polio with these two symbols, the iron lung and the braces for children. And the other thing is, notice it's a child in there. One of the most horrific things about polio is its victims. It struck babies, toddlers, children, all the way up to young adults, and which means young adults would be mothers, fathers, which would impact the family too. So it was a real heartbreaking disease for that reason, and also for just what it did to people, the paralyzation. These people all were paralyzed to the point where they couldn't breathe, and hence the iron lungs. Let's see something. You know what? I feel like, sorry guys, I'm checking.
You should be able to go back.
I will go back. This particular program is missing a few slides that I wanted, but we can talk about from here. Because I went just a couple of days ago to Warm Springs, and I saw they have this brand new polio exhibit in the historic pools part of the museum. I suggest going there if you have any interest in polio. It's the most comprehensive view of polio I've ever seen. It's brand new. And there I was able to see these iron lungs up close. They have one in their FDR museum, the little White House, but they have this new one that I was actually able to put my arm in the side. I always wondered what it was like to use one of these, like to be a nurse or doctor administering care. These portholes, these models are a little bit different, but they have a rubberized gasket that you put your arm in to help the patient. And the one that I manipulated at Warm Springs had like this hatch for the back, so you could change, a diaper or what have you. So it was really cool to see how those work. And you notice each one of these has a mirror over the patient's head. This was the only way the patient could see the world, through this mirror. And you'll see balloons. In this case, a lot of times they would put a doll, hang a doll on the iron lung, so the little child had something to look at. They also had, trying to see if these models they had a little cup holder that would have a straw. But you notice all the nurses, these required a lot of care. It was hard to be in an iron lung. You had to let go and let the machine do your breathing. And I think that was hard for people. And if there's a malfunction, then you couldn't breathe. So there was a lot of care involved in the iron lung patients. This is a close-up showing you how there's a doll here, and you can see how this little child's lying there. But why I included this slide in particular was this window in the background. You see the parents. Another heartbreaking thing is the kids would be in the polio units for months, if not a year or longer. And their parents weren't allowed to visit them, but on Sundays. In most places, they never anywhere were allowed just to show up whenever they wanted. This is typical to have the parents. In fact, this one's probably fortunate that parents can see through. The kids were just in their own unit. And, I talk about this in my book, and I was really worried when I spoke to, in advance of speaking to a post-polio association group. I was really concerned. Did I get it right? Did I tell their story correctly? And did they feel, I hope they felt honored by it. I was really, really scared. And the first thing they told me is, we've read your book. It is accurate. It is how it is. And we want everybody to read it, because we want everybody to know what it was like to be a child and have to battle this. Nobody knows, nobody cares. And even when they were children, people were, like in the 50s and 60s, when you had any kind of illness or whatever, disability, you're to pretend like you didn't have it. And so these people really, these post-polio patients really want you to know what it was like, what they conquered. And so many went on to be really successful. It made them strong. And so I have a new mission ever since I spoke with them to get the book out there for them, so people know what they endured and conquered. And one woman, I remember, really, she galvanized me. She was in a polio ward at the age of 2 and was there well into her 3rd year. And she did not have her parents. This is just how it was. And so this was just a really tough disease. And they had no treatment. You are witnessing one of the few treatments, the sun. They would put the children in the sun and hope that the warmth of the sun felt, soothed their limbs. And this picture here is actually at Hickory, North Carolina. There was an event called the Miracle of Hickory, where there was such a bad outbreak in Charlotte in 1944 that the hospital filled up. They had children on the lawn. They ran out of ambulances and used hearses to bring the children in. And they built a hospital in 10 days' time to help the polio patients. So they deemed that a miracle. Anyhow, so here's some children getting their sun therapy. And indeed, a reader had told me that her grandmother, every time they go to the beach or whatever, she's always, lifting her dress and putting her legs out because she's soothing her legs from the days when she had polio. Here's another treatment. They would try to straighten the limbs by lashing them down. This is my least favorite picture I show because it shows how painful this was. And it's actually worse than this. They put them oftentimes in casts. They like a full body cast or their full leg in a cast, and these limbs hurt. But they had nothing else. This was the best medicine they had. They thought, well, we're going to try to keep the limbs straight, so we'll put them in casts. They had no way of stopping it. They didn't know how polio worked in the body. For example, their precautions from the time is don't mix with new groups, don't get overtired, don't get chilled, which notice it's in conjunction with swimming. They had this real fear of polio in water and swimming. Some of you will remember how the pools were closed. I remember how the pools were closed. Anyhow, and then but do keep clean. And I love this particular slide because it reminds me of our pandemic when we didn't know. When you don't know how something's caused, all you can do is stay away, isolation and keeping hands clean. Wash your packages and groceries, for example. So, we went through the very thing that they went through. And one thing I haven't noted yet, most folks have no idea polio team till the first vaccine was in 1955. The outbreaks began every summer from 1916. So it's 39 years they went with nothing, no tools to fight this with. But here comes Salk. He was the first one that most, everybody Another woman who had a hand in things was Sister Kenny. I say sister, and it sounds like she's a nun, but she was an Australian nurse. She was really a visiting nurse. She wasn't even an RN. But she noticed in working with patients in the outback, polio patients, that to use warm, wet, hot packs on their affected limbs, applying those repeatedly gave them comfort and also helped with physical therapy. So she brought her method to the US. She was quite the spunky sort. They actually did a movie with her. I think was it Rosalind Russell, if I'm not mistaken, played her. And so she brought her method, which immediately the medical community in the States here turned her down. She was kicked all over the States trying to bring her method to people. But anytime that she demonstrated it, the patients liked it. And so finally at Mayo, they gave her a go and it became the standard care. Even though they really didn't know the mechanics of it, all they knew is that patients wanted it and parents, because their children, felt better, they wanted it too. She was actually driven out though, because she was very outspoken. The head of the March of Dimes and her, they clashed and she was driven back home after a short time. And her institutes bearing her name were left behind and they're still there. And, I had some friends who voiced some in the medical community who said, well, there's no scientific background. She was sort of discredited. And then I talked to some people at the post-polio event who said they'd had the Kenny method and it felt so good. So, that's why it survived. It was the only thing they had and it did feel good for people. Since I knew I wanted to write from a woman's point of view, I looked at those other women that I had just shown, but I got more interested in a lab worker in Sabin's lab as he was trying to develop. Sabin was really trying to figure out how polio worked in the body. And so his lab assistant touched some tissue from an autopsy with a live polio virus at it and contracted a very severe case of polio. She was paralyzed. And instead of giving up, like a lot of polio patients, she came back strong and from her wheelchair became his statistician. And I thought, I like her story. I like her spunk. And I tried to write from her point of view for a while. But I did a little research into the miracle from Hickory, and which, by the way, here's the admissions tent. I don't even know, I guess eventually they had something more permanent than that. Nurses came from all over the country. And here is someone, up here rather, is someone, a doctor checking in a patient in a hearse. So this is how it was. But I became interested in looking at this magazine and this woman here, Dorothy Horseman. And I found that she was in on some of these autopsies with Sabin and had written some scenes with her already. I liked how she was right in the thick of things. This is her showing people how to use a fly trap. For a long time, they thought flies carried polio. So, and they could find some in the flies, some of the virus, but that was not how it worked actually. But so she showed people how to set the fly traps. She took blood. It was part of her job as the Yale polio study unit. There was a fly squad that went all around the world to outbreaks. And she was instrumental in that. So I started to get to know her, and she took over my scenes. And so I gave her the book. Here she is. For example, when she went to Yale, that's the next thing she did. When she needed to have a residency, do her residency after medical school, she had a hard enough time getting into medical school, but that was nothing compared to finding a place that would take her as a resident. She couldn't find anywhere until she heard from somebody who'd already turned her down, Vanderbilt. She was surprised that they turned her down, but she appeared, and evidently the chief of medicine got confused because he forgot that D.M. Horseman on her resume was a woman. So when Dorothy Millicent Horseman showed up, I guess he just about passed out, and he finally got used to her. But she loved telling that story her whole life about how she shocked him, and he had to keep her. It was a big mistake on his part. She had difficulties getting into Yale. Her next step was a fellowship, and she, had a hard time finding that. So when she interviewed there, the dean said, I hired a woman, the door being opened for her to be shoved out, and said, if you had a man who made a mistake, would you never hire men from then on? And what could he say? So he took her on, and she stayed there the rest of her life. In fact, she became the first full professor in the Yale School of Medicine. So she was a virologist. She was part of this Yale polio study unit, which is really epidemiology. She was a pediatrician. She wore a lot of hats. Here she is in a hat, as a matter of fact, in Stockholm. She was at a symposium in this picture. She's with her boss, who was teeny tiny compared to her. She was 6'1", which I had a lot of fun with because I have a daughter who's 6'1", and when she was a teenager and came into her height, she was very tall and skinny. I was shocked that everywhere we went, just getting groceries, Macy's, Paris, one time, people would come up to her and say, "You're tall." It didn't make any sense to me, but I had to use that. I used that for Dorothy, and Dorothy had comebacks. Like Megan and I would never think of a comeback, but Dorothy has some comebacks for that in the book. So being a novelist, and we have some novelists amongst us here, I look at pictures. I was fortunate to get a whole trove of pictures from a portraitist who did her portrait. I'll show you in a minute. But I look at these and you try to read the character and the situation. And in this one, I see Dorothy being Dorothy. This is how she looks in almost every picture. She's just loving life. And to me, he looks like he's a little bit, little smitten. Now that might be the novelist in me, but I did a whole storyline on it that he, was kind of smitten by her. This is typical of her. She's in Tahiti. I did a scene on this too. That's the beauty of photos. I really do use them for scenes. And you notice on this picture, she has labeled it. That's her handwriting. And on the back of all these photos are labels too, if it's not on top. Every photo is labeled, except for that one, which I will tell you about in a moment. So the portraitist was Alistair Adams, which Yale figured out that they had better do a portrait stat in 2019 because they have on their halls all of their greats that have worked at Yale. And they had this tiny little picture of her, just this crummy little photo. And they realized she has done a lot. She made these major discoveries, which I will talk to you about in a moment. And we have nothing. And so they hired this man. And I contacted him because I was formulating a story about that sprung from Dorothy telling a colleague, you know, women can't have everything. And she said this, it really got to me because here's a woman who discovered things that changed the world, and she's saying women can't have everything. She's a powerful woman saying this. She said, I had to give up a lot in order to do what I needed to do. And that really was one of the driving themes in my book. So I thought, along those lines, what did she give up? Well, she had no family. She never married, had children. Actually, very little is known about her. There's not a lot of personal stuff about her. So I gave her a backstory, and I gave her someone to give up and to see, you know, how that was. So I had developed this. Well, first of all, I saw this little dish here. I was developing this character, this man. I decided it would be someone from Denmark, so I'd just been to Denmark, and I love Denmark. And I heard this coolest story about there was this group of school teachers that in 1944, when Germany occupied Denmark, yes, that this group of teachers banded together and decided they had to get all the Danish Jews out. And so they put the plan that they would just use tiny crafts. Anybody who had a rowboat, whatever, on a certain night in October in 44, 7,000 Danish Jews made the trip across the Sound. It's pretty, you could see the other side. You could see Sweden from Denmark. So they made this trip across successfully. They got everybody out. And it was really kind of an amazing moment. And I thought, Dorothy deserved someone who would be that heroic. And so I was thinking, you know, about this character who I named Arna. And I thought, when I saw this little dish, I thought, oh, you know, I wonder if this little dish had anything to do with my character. So I asked Alistair Adams why he included this dish in his portrait. And he said, well, you know, is it all the pictures of her in her office? It must have had a lot of significance to her. Storyline came through that, and there's a lot of plot through that little dish. And I was looking at the photos that Alistair Adams sent me very kindly. But most of those pictures you've seen of Dorothy are ones that he'd sent me from Yale, actually, her archives. This is the only picture, this one on the right here, that my right. Anyhow, this one is different in that one, there's no label to it. It's the only one that doesn't tell anything about it. Two, Dorothy doesn't have her normal confident smile in it, her normal being. And they just seem to have, there's something going on in that photo. There's a connection being made, or so the novelist in me thinks. So I developed the character from knowing this, seeing this. So Dorothy did make a discovery that changed the whole trajectory of the vaccine. It was from her discovery they were able to know how polio worked in the body. I won't go into it much more because I hope you'll read the book. But when she made this discovery, she actually had the idea for it 9 years before she actually announced her discovery. And everybody in the scientific, or at least polio community, knew her theory about polio being in the bloodstream. She had seen it one time and she was sure it was there, and that was her mission to find it. But she was discredited and you know, there's kind of, no, that can't be. Well, about 7 years later, after she started her, you know, had her theory, this other scientist, David Bodian, he said, hey, I think polio virus can be found in the bloodstream. And so he did his work. And so at the same time, simultaneously, they had their joint discovery. Though this was really, something that she'd been working on longer. So this was a big deal, and Time Magazine knew it. They sent out a reporter and photographer, and right after the announcement was made, they posed them together. And this burned me up and made me have to write this book as well. They posed her like she's his secretary, when it was her idea. Yeah, it looks like, so this is the sort of thing that she was up against all along. And I think she did not let it stop her. I think it bothered Isabel Morgan, and surely it bothered her, but I feel like she was not in a competition. She was not in it for credit. She was in it to spare children from polio. And so Salk had his vaccine out in 55. There were some problems with Salk's vaccine. And so Sabin's had a chance to come to the forefront. Sabin's vaccine was more complicated to develop. Plus, he didn't get the funding. The March of Dimes loved Salk and his bubbly personality, and he got the money. So anyhow, Sabin had his vaccine, and Russia was having this terrible outbreak. Everybody took their turns with it, having it, there were terrible outbreaks. And Russia asked the US for some vaccine. The Salk vaccine was not available because of the problem that they had with it. Sabin's had not been on the market yet, or tested even, except on some prisoners and other situations like that. So they delivered it to, or administered it to 77 million children, all told. The world's biggest trial, vaccine trial ever. And the Soviet Union, being in the middle of the Cold War with the US, only would allow one scientist to go over there and evaluate that trial. One person with a 77 million trial. And who did the WHO, the World Health Organization, choose? Dorothy Horseman. And this is a picture of her in the lab there. So she evaluated the results that they had, and she deemed it safe and effective. And so it was on her say-so, actually, that some of us got the oral vaccine. It was on her say-so you got that sugar cube vaccines, right? And which meant any of us who got that, you remember it. If you got it in school, it was such an event. It was just everybody who got it like in the 60s, early 60s remembers that well. So later on I think this is the 60s as well, they decided to honor all these people who contributed to the polio vaccines and the race to end it. And there's all the greats there. There's Dr. Paul, Dorothy Horseman's mentor. There's Sabin, there's Joe Melnick, there's Isabel Morgan, there's Howie Howe. There is David Bodian next to Saul, and Eleanor and Basil O'Connor. Where's Dorothy? Where's Dorothy? She contributed every bit as much as David Bodian, and where's Dorothy? It's not like she couldn't show up for the day, because it took him a while to make those casts, So she was just not included, which is another thing that galvanized me to write this book. So here she is, our Dorothy. I just want to remember her for her smile and her determination and the way she changed the world. And that is the end of my presentation. Anybody have any questions that they might have?
We do have some questions from the chat.
Okay. Oh, and Annelle has one too.
Okay, Annelle.
Annelle, you want to hit it first?
So the children that were in those islands, or people, they were in there 24 hours a day?
Yes.
The whole year?
Yes. Now, some people graduated to a chest model, and a woman came up with the rocking bed that they would use instead and do the same thing with pressure. When they got a little bit better, if they weren't really extreme, they could have the rocking bed. And some just needed it at night. There's a woman here, I think she's in Georgia, one of the last women who uses an iron lung, and she likes it at night. She's used to it. It's hard for her to find the parts for it, but it gives her comfort at night. So you can, people did outgrow them in most cases. Yes.
When was the iron lung invented?
Oh, gosh.
I mean, was it already, wasn't invented because of?
It was for polio. Yes, by a man named Drinker. And I cannot remember the year. It's a good question. I think it was fairly early on. I think it was in the 20s. I'm not positive about that. If it says in the book, that's right. Because I'm going to say right now, my book is so much more accurate than I am. Because I did all the work and I put it in there and checked it, and I forget things. Yes.
Where was the first noted outbreak?
Yeah, that's, thank you.
She wanted to know where the first noted outbreak was. New York City had a huge one, and there were some other small towns outside of New York that out east that treated it like the plague, like plague villages with these small towns. They would put a roadblock keeping people in and people out of those towns. They didn't know what to do that first year. They probably figured, well, we lived through this one. Little did they know it would come back and come back. They stopped doing the roadblocks because that's not practical, and it was more widespread. But the worst of this big case or big outbreak in 1916 was in New York City. Yes.
One of our Zoom attendees heard you speak about a museum, and
Oh,
she
yes.
asked immediately what museum, but we
Right.
wanted- what-
Yes.
So,
I'm happy to reiterate that. That was the Warm Springs Museum. There's the Little White House. The Little White House in Warm Springs. It's a state park. It's got a great FDR exhibit, like you could see the Little White House, which is fabulous. It's a time machine. Talked to the director, and he said he thought, what a missed opportunity not to have a museum there devoted to polio, because the reason FDR was at Warm Springs was to get the treatment in the springs there. And so this director set up this fantastic museum that's part of the site that is the historic pools, which he says they're also going to be renovating the pools and making them available 4 times a year, which you're going to want to go. I didn't know this. I've been to their place many times, and they let you touch the water. But this time I, touched the water, and the director waited up top, and he came back and said, did you feel the water? And I said, yeah. And he said, it was great on the patients because it made them buoyant. It's more buoyant than salt water, and the chemicals are good. But he said, feel your hand. And I felt my hand. I don't know if I should be letting out the secret because I'm afraid somebody's going to drain the springs, but it made my hand incredibly smooth. I mean, it was miraculous. You could feel right where the water, edge was. And this is just like that in the water. This is not soaking in it. So it had these amazing properties. Yeah, I do hope somebody doesn't take it away because it's wonderful. I wish they could figure out what's in that. It's so soothing. Yes.
You mentioned that there would be a summer resurgence. What accounted for that?
I can't tell you. I don't know. And it was only in the summer. They really didn't have cases in the winter and fall. I'm not sure why. there's a lot of things that are so mysterious about polio. They have no cure for it, it's just the vaccine, which is very effective. At least we have that. Yes.
Do we ever determine the actual source of the polio?
Well, she wants to know if they ever determine the source of the polio. Do you mean how you get it? Is that?
It doesn't come from, I just started with it, but does it come from sewage, does it come from food, is it airborne?
It comes from feces.
Feces.
Yes, hand to mouth feces directly. And it took them so long to figure that out. They thought it was in water. The Swedes thought it was in apples that fell to the ground. There were all kinds of crazy theories about how you got it. In fact, one man said, people would send in their ideas on how to cure it or where it came from to Sabin, who was the wrong person to send any idea like that to, because he could be very abrasive, especially to another medical person. So there's a doctor in Vienna who said, I have injected my patients with their own urine and it has cured them of polio. Now, they didn't get headaches, nausea, joint pain, I can't remember, but every other ailment you could possibly think of, but it did cure them. Anyhow, Sabin didn't have kind words for him. What else was I going to say about how it? Oh, one thing about polio, the first outbreak was in modern times was in 1916, but polio has been with man for a very long time. They feel like there's pictures from ancient Egypt that show polio patients, and all along there have been patients that have had polio. It's just that most people, before sanitation improved, got these minor cases as children. They all were exposed a little bit, so kind of like what a vaccine is. They all were exposed a little bit, but when we all stopped being exposed a little bit, then we got polio. Yes.
Presentation, Marcus.
Oh, thank you.
I'm a pediatrician.
Oh.
This is all those medical school.
Yeah.
And first issue, they don't medical term. First part of it, they don't look this up in research. Was America, I think it was where there was a new outbreak in some small town. Beautiful children who had developed the disease following fever and diarrhea. Yes, you're right, ancient Egypt, you have these pictures of statues of people with full limbs. And the thinking was that this disease had been present for thousands of years.
Right.
But sewage systems separated sewerage from clean drinking water. And what happened was, as our sewer systems got perfected, people would be born with never drink contaminated sewage water. Right. And
He's putting in better terms, everything I just said.
the fact is that if you get this disease, most people get very mild form of disease.
Right.
They don't develop paralysis.
Right.
You develop immunity, you get antibodies. And so it's a very common thing for children before the last century to get some contamination in the water and they get mild form of disease while they still have mother's antibodies.
Right.
So the maternal antibody would be passed to the new babies. Babies would get some contaminated water, and they would get a milder form of disease, and they would have antibodies. The mothers themselves, over the years, as they were drinking water, never developed their own antibodies. And so babies were born without any potential maternal antibody, no protection at all. And that's how it really transformed from what we call an endemic disease, which happens now and again over and over, to an epidemic disease. We get a whole bunch of sewer system gets into the drinking water. And that also relates to time of the year, when kids go in water, when they swim, and that swimming water gets contaminated with these certain kind of storage, and then our fish can be infected with very much because of the mothers in the body, they kind of transform into epidemic disease.
Thank you for spelling out what I clumsily say. But yes, and Dorothy was a pediatrician too. And I thought of her job prior to, the vaccine, prior to, widespread use of penicillin and things like that. But, I love going to cemeteries. I'm morbid that way. I love old cemeteries, and I love looking at the baby and mother graves and children graves, which sounds hideous, but to me, it's always been an affirmation of how far we've come with medicine. And I think back, and I had Dorothy thinking back, or living this, how different a job would be for a pediatrician back even in the 50s, where you'd have to tell parents that, the child was lost. And, I could see that being a spur to her trying to do things, because she went on to work on the rubella vaccine after things were finished with polio. There was always something that she wanted to do. And I thought this has to be partly because she didn't want to have to tell parents, another parent, that you've lost your child. So have you ever thought about that, how your job would be so much different if you'd been practicing several decades earlier?
There's nothing harder than giving bad news.
Yeah.
Very emotional. And never parallel with them. It's certainly for the person who lives when we think about
Yes.
Salk's,
Yeah.
Salk's vaccine or Dorothy's vaccine, whatever you want to say.
Well, Salk, Isabel Morgan is actually the first one who had that. Yeah.
It is still virus.
Right.
What they do is they put a certain amount of formula. It kills the virus, but the formula you were talking about in the laboratory had that substance in half of the immunogenicity that it caused the body to react to it, but not cause the disease. It's a much simpler vaccine than the saving vaccine.
Exactly.
The saving vaccine is a very complicated, elegant vaccine. And you'll see on the containers that have the vaccine, as HPV, high passing virus, it's attenuated. And the way you make a live vaccine, you grow it in the altered conditions. You change the egg, you change the it grows in. And each time it grows, you go back and test it to see if it still causes the disease. And so when they did this, high passing virus number 40 different cycles that went, they finally came up with a virus that would cause antibody formation, that would cause disease.
Yes, Zabin said the difference was between making the two was between the same as slaughtering a cow and breeding a cow. One's a lot easier.
So that's much more sophisticated vaccine.
Yes.
And that became the preferred vaccine for a long time, but occasionally you get over.
Right.
Right. And so now there's a new vaccine produced in the United States, which is not the soft vaccine. It is a full vaccine.
Right. Yeah, it is. So we went back. He won in the long run, but it's really not a matter of winning and losing. We win by all the science. Yes. Yes.
How hard and easy was it to get into these?
is it what? Actually, this was during COVID, and I didn't do interviews. In fact, one of the things I appreciated about Dorothy Horseman is not much is known about her, and she has no living relatives other than two great nieces that I think one didn't even live in the US. And so as a writer, I can inject a lot of my research into her as opposed to, getting exactly what people thought of her. Though I did hear from a few people who thought she was the most warm, amazingly kind person. But like her parents and her family in the book, the information I have for them is just from censuses and city directories. Any other questions?
What was the death rate before the vaccination?
The death rate before the vaccine. Yeah. Do you know the death rate before the vaccine in 50? Well, I just know this. Maybe you could give some other figures. I know in 52 was the very worst year, and there were 68,000 paralytic cases, which doesn't sound like a lot. To me, it sounds like a lot of children in the US to be paralyzed, but it was a cumulative year after year. And it's that children had to fight this for so long that made it scary, but it was not as widespread. And the death rate of it was never huge. As you pointed out, most people did beat it. You were really unlucky if you were paralyzed and really unlucky if you were killed, but it could happen. It didn't happen. Yeah. And also whole families with children would die. I mean, there were some, standout horrible things that happened with this. So it was very important to beat it. And it's really important for us to still be taking our polio, the children to get the vaccines, because it hasn't gone away, not quite.
I love this story. It's wonderful. So much of it is relevant to the COVID story.
Oh, yes. I haven't even talked about that today. Yeah.
Oh, my goodness, you can write a whole book for us. What we learned from polio and what we are utterly not aware of and disregarding about COVID. So many people who are anti-vaccine or vaccine deniers don't understand what they're walking through.
Well, exactly. That's the thing. They did such a good job. The people who developed the vaccine for polio did such a good job that it's gone from our memory how bad it was. And if people realize, and that is one thing I'm glad that my book is out there about, if people realize how bad it was, they would not hesitate to take the vaccines. And they would also have more confidence in the FDA, which came from what happened with the polio vaccine. Remember, I mentioned that Salk's vaccine ran into some problems, and it made this FDA have to really step up their game. And there are a lot of things actually that polio has affected today that we take for granted. But it changed medicine in some ways. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Tell me how old she was. 89, was it? Okay, because I'm terrible at numbers. I have to. I know she lived a long time. She died of Alzheimer's, which is really sad. Her colleague Joe Melnick, that she worked with for years, he died, I think, like the same day or very much close in time that week, whatever, of Alzheimer's too. And my friend who I got the idea from originally about the race for the vaccine, her husband works for the CDC, and she was telling me that 5 of the polio researchers died of Alzheimer's, which that seems like a large percentage of the people. So I don't know what's there. Need to study. I'm not going to do it. But, anyhow.
Just a reminder, for Pride bookstores are selling copies of all, or lots of your books.
Oh, are
in the
they?
back.
Oh,
Yeah, yeah,
thank you.
he's got quite a variety back there.
Okay.
And our next event will be June 24th. It'll be Terry Parlato. Her book is called All the Dark Places. It's a domestic suspense thing. It's been described as a diabolically twisted story from a new master of domestic suspense. And this one will be across the street at the Cultural Arts Center. They have a new room there. We're going to try it out. Should also be a hybrid event. Roswell Reed's next event will be.
And it's called the B-side stage. Sorry, that's.
And to announce the next Roswell Reed's event, which will be a book discussion, a virtual book discussion of Remarkably Bright Creatures by Shelby Van Pelt. Tuesday, May 9th, sign up for the virtual book discussion. You can go at 2 p.m. or 7 p.m. RoswellReads.com. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Yes.
Like, someone is direction, it's back to that way.